August 12th, 2020. The morning air in northeast Scotland is heavy with rain. Roads glisten. Fields are soaked. But for the 7 passengers boarding the 6:38 ScotRail Inter7City service from Aberdeen to Glasgow, the weather feels like just another part of a damp Scottish summer. The train, Service 1T08, is a familiar sight. A refurbished high-speed train, it's been in use for decades. Today, it's running light. Only 2 crew members and 7 passengers on board, a reflection of the pandemic-era travel restrictions still in place across the UK. It leaves Aberdeen on time, rolling south past the small towns and rolling countryside that edge the North Sea. But as it approaches the village of Carmont, the rain intensifies. Unbeknownst to those on board, the real danger isn't ahead. It's already behind them. At 6:53, Network Rail receives word of a landslip just south of the Carmont signal box. A section of track is now covered by debris. The route is no longer safe. Control contacts the train's driver with new instructions. Stop the train. The line is blocked. They'll need to return to Aberdeen. The driver acknowledges. He stops. Then, in accordance with railway rules, the train begins to reverse northward, back toward the city it had just left. It is a decision made to avoid danger, but the real danger lies unseen, just up the line. At 9:36, the train rounds a curve near Carmont at 73 miles per hour. Up ahead, a landslip. Mud, stones, and vegetation have washed down an embankment, spilling over the rails. The storm has already done its damage. The train doesn't stand a chance. The front power car strikes the debris. The wheels lift, the frame twists, and in a matter of seconds, a rolling, roaring disaster unfolds. The lead power car leaves the tracks and plunges down a steep embankment. The first carriage follows, flipping onto its roof. The second derails and lands atop the first. Other carriages crumple like paper, jackknifing into the undergrowth. Metal screams, glass shatters. Trees snap like matchsticks. The ground is torn open where the train once ran. Of the 9 people on board, 3 will not survive. The driver, Brett McCullough, the conductor, Donald Dinny, and a passenger, Christopher Stutchbury, all killed instantly in the chaos. 6 others are injured, some critically, and trapped in the wreckage. Locals describe hearing a sound like thunder, then silence, then sirens. Emergency responders arrive quickly. The area is remote, accessible only by foot and air. Helicopters hover over the trees. Rescue crews pick their way through the wreckage. First aid is administered in the shadow of overturned carriages. A major incident is declared. And by evening, the images begin to circulate. A shattered train at the foot of a wooded hill. Carriages flung like dice. The scars of impact carved into the landscape. In a country that prides itself on railway safety, the news hits hard. It is Scotland's worst rail disaster in over 20 years. But as investigators begin their work, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just an accident. It was a tragedy set in motion by a perfect storm of missed warnings, overlooked hazards, and a system not built for the new normal of extreme weather. The derailment is over. But the story has only just begun. The wreckage still lay scattered across the hillside as the first investigators arrived. What looked, at first glance, like a natural disaster, a freak accident triggered by nature, soon began revealing signs of something more complex. The question was simple. Why was that landslip there at all? And why didn't anyone know it was coming? The Rail Accident Investigation Branch, the RAI-IB, quickly took control of the scene. Their job wasn't just to document what happened, but to understand why it happened, down to the last bolt and raindrop. The weather was the first obvious factor. That morning, 51.5 millimeters of rain had fallen in the region, more than half the average rainfall for the entire month of August in just 3 hours. Nearby drainage ditches overflowed. Hillsides wept mud and runoff. To some, it seemed like the derailment was a cruel twist of fate, nature doing what nature does. But the RAIB wasn't satisfied with that. Investigators retraced the path of the train, the orders it was given, and the conditions that led up to the landslip. What they found, buried in the soil above the tracks, told a different story. A drainage trench, installed sometime between 2011 and 2012, had failed catastrophically. It was designed to collect and redirect water flowing down the slope. Water just like the rain that fell that morning. But when crews uncovered the trench, something was wrong. It hadn't been built to spec. The drainage pipe itself was laid incorrectly and not to the depth required. The backfill materials didn't match the approved design, and the area surrounding the trench, meant to direct water safely into the system, had been altered. A low earth bund, a sort of berm, had formed or been left above the slope. Instead of slowing water down, it channeled the storm water directly into one spot, putting immense pressure on the drainage system. That pressure built up behind the pipe. Eventually, it overflowed, washed through loose soil, and carried rock, roots, and debris straight onto the tracks. The slope collapsed. The drainage system had failed, not because of natural disaster, but because it was improperly built. A man-made failure masquerading as an act of nature. And the company responsible for the construction? Carillion. The same firm that had collapsed into liquidation 2 years earlier in 2018, after widespread accusations of mismanagement and corner-cutting across public infrastructure projects. But the damage was already done. And the train that derailed, 1T08, had been sent back along that same stretch of track with no warning of what lay ahead. That too raised questions. Why had no one flagged the danger? Why weren't the route controllers aware of the risk? As investigators dug deeper, they found more gaps. This time in communication and decision-making. The line controller who redirected the train was following protocol. But that protocol hadn't been updated to reflect the rising threat posed by extreme weather. There were no specific instructions for this kind of scenario. No real-time satellite imaging, no landslide sensors, no mandatory speed reductions on recently rain-drenched track. The crew aboard train 1T08 were professionals. They followed every instruction they were given, but the instructions weren't good enough. What failed that day wasn't just the slope or the drain. It was the assumption that heavy rain could be handled the same way it always had. But the climate had changed. The infrastructure hadn't. And the system that was supposed to protect passengers had missed every sign. By the time the RAIB released its preliminary findings, the tragedy at Carmont was no longer being treated as an isolated incident. It had become something else entirely, a symbol of what happens when a complex system relies too heavily on trust and too little on verification. The public was already asking hard questions. Now investigators were doing the same. One of the first targets for scrutiny was the company behind the drainage works, Carillion. At the time of construction, Carillion had been one of the UK's largest contractors, responsible for countless infrastructure projects, from rail to hospitals. But it was also a company riddled with controversy. In 2018, Carillion collapsed into insolvency, buried under debt and allegations of widespread cost-cutting, project delays, and safety concerns. The drainage system near Carmont was one of their projects, built between 2011 and 2012. What should have been a simple installation, designed to last decades, had become a quiet liability. No one noticed, no one checked. And by the time the rain fell in August 2020, the failure was already waiting. Network Rail, which had overseen the contract, bore some of the responsibility. They had signed off on the work. They had accepted the system, but they had never verified that it had been built to the original specifications. And that's where the second layer of failure emerged. After the landslide, investigators examined the as-built documentation, the final version of the construction plans that indicated what had actually been built, not just what had been designed. They found inconsistencies. Drainage pipes weren't where they were supposed to be. Materials weren't what had been specified. Even the geometry of the trench was off. And yet, for nearly a decade, no one had inspected it. No one thought they needed to, because on paper, everything was fine. This blind spot wasn't limited to construction oversight. It extended to the operational side of Britain's rail network too. At the time of the crash, Network Rail had protocols for landslides and extreme weather. But those protocols relied heavily on human judgment. Judgment that, in the case of Carmont, didn't have the tools it needed. The route controllers who managed 1T08's journey had no access to live satellite data. They had no real-time information on how saturated the soil was near Carmont. They didn't even have the authority to reduce the train's speed unless a direct threat had already been observed. So when they made the call to turn the train back, they were making the safest decision they could, within a system that hadn't kept up with the risk. No one at the control desk that morning could have known that a 10-year-old drainage failure, buried in a hillside and forgotten, was about to turn a safe route into a disaster zone. The final RAIB report, released in 2022, was damning. It found that the drainage system was not constructed to the approved design, that Network Rail had failed to verify the work. That extreme rainfall, while intense, was within predictable levels, and that the combination of these factors had led directly to the derailment. The report included 20 recommendations for the rail industry. Among them, better construction oversight, improved weather monitoring, and stronger decision-making frameworks for route controllers during extreme conditions. But the most public consequence came from Scotland's legal system. In September 2023, Network Rail pled guilty to health and safety failings. The company was fined £6.70 million, one of the largest penalties ever issued for a rail-related offence in the UK. It was a formal acknowledgement that the system had failed, not just mechanically, but morally. Because the tragedy at Carmont didn't happen because of one mistake. It happened because of a chain of assumptions. That construction was completed properly. That old infrastructure could handle new extremes. That people would catch the problem before it mattered, but no one did. And the cost of those assumptions was paid in lives. After the verdict and the £6.7 million fine, the story of Carmont could have ended there, filed away as another tragic statistic in the long history of rail disasters. But it didn't. Because for the people closest to the tragedy, those who survived it, those who investigated it, and those who lost loved ones, moving on meant making sure something changed. Network Rail responded quickly, publicly, with urgency. They committed £1.6 billion over 5 years to make Britain's railways more resilient to extreme weather. That meant upgraded drainage systems, better trackside sensors, and new guidelines for monitoring vulnerable areas like cuttings and embankments. It also meant finally acknowledging a hard truth. The climate had changed, and the infrastructure had to catch up. More than 580 sites across the network were identified as being at risk from similar failures. Emergency inspections were ordered. Repair crews were deployed. Drainage blueprints were dusted off and cross-checked against what had actually been built, because Carmont wasn't just a tragedy. It was a blueprint for everything that could go wrong when assumptions replace accountability. At the same time, the RAIB's recommendations began reshaping how decisions are made on the railways. Route controllers were given better access to live weather data. New technology was trialed. Remote sensing equipment, rainfall triggers, and slope monitoring systems that could send alerts before a landslip even happens. Training programs were updated, emphasizing the kinds of judgment calls that had once relied too heavily on guesswork. But even with all this, the most powerful changes weren't just technical. They were personal. Memorials were held, trees planted, names remembered. Brett McCullough, Donald Dinny, Christopher Stoochberry. 3 lives lost not to reckless speed or sabotage, but to the quiet failures that happen when systems aren't questioned. Their families pushed for transparency, not just compensation. They wanted to know how a train could be sent back over a line after a known landslip. They wanted to know how a drainage system could be left unchecked for almost a decade. And they wanted answers that didn't come wrapped in policy or protocol. In the months after the crash, ScotRail and Network Rail executives met with victims' families. They listened. They apologized. But even then, trust wasn't easily repaired. And why should it be? This was a modern railway in a developed nation with decades of safety standards behind it, and still, it had failed. For railway workers across the UK, Carmont became a wake-up call. Unions pushed for stricter inspection routines. Engineers revisited old designs. Supervisors checked jobs that, until now, had been considered routine. And yet, questions remain. Extreme weather is becoming more common. Infrastructure continues to age. And even the best systems are only as good as the people and policies that oversee them. The lesson from Carmont isn't just about rain, or drains, or landslips. It's about attention. The kind of vigilance that asks hard questions before tragedy strikes, not after. The kind that treats safety not as a checklist, but as a culture. Because no matter how strong the bolts, or how deep the pipes, or how advanced the sensors, none of it matters if no one's paying attention. Carmont was a catastrophe. But it was also a warning, and whether that warning is heeded is still being written.